I have to say that it's very exciting to join this panel, largely because I'm among friends and colleagues. So it's inspiring to also speak on the same panel as people I've admired for many, many years. I'm going to talk to you about tea today. And as I speak to you, Vinita, I wanted to tell you that speaking of climate, a snowstorm is raging outside our windows in upstate New York, where I am based and where I'm speaking to you from. So tea encounters, where does this take us? When you think about tea, especially in India, we are immediately, of course, reminded of, hold on, I haven't gone to SlideShare yet. I beg your pardon, just a second. Here we go. Here we go. Let's start with the drink itself. The tea stall, which is ubiquitous in all cities, mainly in the north and the northeast of India. Countless people begin their day with a sip of tea, their cup of joy. And then we also, of course, have tea parties. And I'm showing you two vintage advertisements, which give you a sense of how gendered tea drinking has been shown as in the advertising industry itself. And this still continues today. And also, of course, we have the issue of class and the modernizing, quote unquote, of the Indian woman as she takes on the British tea drinking ceremony. One of my favorite paintings, in fact, to come to us through the history of art is this particular one by Johann Zoffany called The Oriole and Dashwood Families. It's set in Bengal, and it gives us actually some of the most luminary characters of the city of Calcutta. So Vinita mentioned Calcutta at the beginning of her talk. I happen to be from Calcutta myself. So there will be a few references to Calcutta, which also happens to be the hub of the Indian tea industry till this day from its historic beginnings. So if you look very closely at the center of the painting, we have two women who are controlling, who are in charge of the tea ceremony. And I couldn't help but show you all three images to demonstrate how this 18th century culture is resonating across more modern, later times. In fact, we can think of our panel as a virtual tea party in and of itself. But I want to take us today away from the teacup and the teapot to the plantation. And tea, in fact, as all of us know on this webinar, is as iconic as the Taj Mahal is in India. It's an iconic Indian product. And looking beyond the Taj Mahal box of tea over here, made by the company Brook Bond, is an image that the tea industry wants you to keep in mind, that of rolling hills, misty slopes, tea workers or tea pluckers diligently working in the tea bushes, very much an artisanal product. In other words, this particular image was taken not far from where Shumona herself lives, up in the hills of Darjeeling, famous for the Himalayan mist that unfurls across its slopes, a magical place for growing tea. If we look here, we also have a direct reference to, in fact, the landscapes that Vinita talked about. Joseph Dalton Hooker has been through this exact same area that I am showing you here. The Kanchenjunga in the background, a magnificent view from Glenburn Tea Estate. Most of the tea estates in Darjeeling do look at that gorgeous Himalayan range that you can see beyond. And I'm telling you all of this because if you start looking really closely at these contemporary photographs of ornamental gardens, of gorgeous flowers. Now, all of these are plants which have been put into the landscape. In other words, we are looking at the impact of deforestation. If you look at the mountain slopes beyond, you will actually see patches where the forest has been removed. And much has been said about deforestation already. Just as a reminder, a shout out now to Edward Lear. Amy Myers, the former director of the Yale Center for British Art, began the symposium with her wonderful colleague, Teresa O'Malley. And I couldn't help but bring this painting to your attention. Edward Lear's magnificent view of the country. And you can see the lush vegetation here. Professor Batsaki, Yota, you spoke about ferns. You can see the magnificent spread of ferns right in the foreground of this painting as well. This comes to us from a time when deforestation has just begun in Darjeeling, leading to, of course, ornamental plantation bungalows like the one that you're seeing here. So plantations themselves, living sites of plants. This is the sites that I will talk about today. What's interesting about plantations, of course, is that they are carved out of forested area. And in India, they remain very connected to the forest, both ecologically, as well as materially, as well as culturally. And I'm showing you a print from the 19th century in the Wellcome collection of how plantations were prepared in India in the 19th century. This is when plantation culture begins in India. And you can see how close it is to the idea of gardening. The section that I want you to focus on is this one, where the plantation not only levels out the forest is gone. In fact, the tree stump that you're seeing here is a physical trace of that lost landscape. But what you have here is an organized landscape, one that is organized now with almost militaristic precision, which brings to mind something that the terrific cultural anthropologist Anna Singh has written about, that plantations were the engine of European expansion. And that in fact, when we look at this remaking of landscapes, and Singh talks about this, that it's very, very important that the native entanglements, human and non-human, between wild plants as well as wild animals and humans have to be extinguished. When you look at a plantation today, you will see that those bushes have now become human height length, or they grow at human height almost, chest height actually. So the baby bushes that you're seeing planted here have now matured into that militaristic precision. And it's a very manicured, it's a highly manicured landscape, which is also indicative of scale, because now we see a radical shift of scalar relations from what the forest represents, this huge, unruly, tangled, cluttered, fabulously rich biogeography, to the scale that is manageable. It's on human terms, and again, at human height. Which brings to mind, of course, plantations as sites of labor. And this question, I think, has come up in the feed earlier on. And here we have another 19th century photograph of the kind of physical labor it took to organize plantations. This is, of course, after the trees have been felled, and there's a whole other history behind that, and a very rich visual history as well, I should add. But what's important here is that the landscape is being remade by human hand, slowly but surely. And you can see the aisles between the tea bushes being cleared out. If you look at images also of sugar plantations, sugarcane plantations, cotton plantations, you will find an almost identical layout of bushes, or rather the plant from which the natural resource is extracted. So these aisles are supposed to open up these corridors in which human beings will in fact go in to harvest the plant as well. Which now brings me to the hands of the tea plucker, the very, very important figure who is navigating these landscapes on a near daily basis. So the plucking of the plant in a very orderly landscape brings us to the idea of remaking the plant itself. So this is not just about the remaking of landscapes, but about how entire plants are now being reshaped thanks to the plant industry, in this case, of course, the tea industry. I wanted to also show a personal encounter with tea. This is at Mathura Tea Estate, where I plucked tea for the first time in 2016. And I must admit that I was thrilled and at the same time very humbled by the experience. This particular plantation is very special to my family. My great-grandfather planted it more than 100 years ago. So an homage to him today as I speak about tea to you. And it's important to keep in mind that as those hands are plucking tea, they're pruning, they're removing leaves, but they're also in many ways forcing the plant to be more fertile. They're also inducing the plant to produce more leaves. When you look at the tea plant in the form of a tea bush, which is what you're seeing here, it is essentially a bonsai-like practice. Tea, if you allow it to grow naturally, the plant itself will grow up to 15 feet. In fact, if you visit the Darjeeling Botanical Gardens, the Lloyd Botanical Gardens there, they have a full-grown tea tree which flowers. You will not recognize it because it doesn't look like the tea bush. So think again about scale, where you're taking a full-grown tree and you're forcing it into a bush that then will repeatedly give you tea leaves. The tea flower, which I did not talk about today, but which I presented on in many other fora, is a beautiful botanical. When you talk to tea planters, they are standing and they're working at the intersection of botany as well as the plant humanities, as well as economics, of course. They have an interesting take on the plant as a commodity. To them, a tea bush, if it flowers, is under distress. If you speak to a botanist, if the tea bush flowers, it is in fact doing exactly what it should be. And oftentimes that is the way to verify a species. So it's fascinating to see two very different approaches to the plant, which of course are also interconnected at the same time. So this notion of remaking the plant, of really controlling the height of the bush, the quality of the leaf itself, becomes almost a visual trope to the extent that we see this normalized, it becomes a picturesque trope, it becomes part and parcel of the advertising industry. And postcards depicting women laborers plucking tea in particular proliferate throughout the late 19th century and well into our present day times. I'm just showing you one of the many postcards that you can find in shops in tea growing areas. This one is from Darjeeling, again, with the happy tea workers among the bushes, to the point where, of course, the woman becomes part and parcel of that extended tea bush, right? She looks like she belongs, she looks like she's rooted in the earth, and it's almost as if her fecundity and the fecundity of the tea bush parallel each other or complement each other. And there is a glimpse of a close-up of the two leaves and the bud. This is what the tea pluckers are picking. I should say that after having tried to pluck tea myself, I was a disaster at it. It is very difficult to pluck without bruising the plant. So I have immense respect now for these women who pluck at terrific speeds. The tea picker has also been romanticized through Bollywood. Vidya Balan here as a tea picker in Porinita. And what's fascinating to me is that the women who are in fact plucking the tea are also makers of scientific knowledge. And this is something we forget. We've talked about Adivasis. Certainly many of these women are coming, actually all of them are coming from Adivasi communities. They are living with the plant every single day, so their knowledge is deep, and they are yet to be tapped as citizen scientists who can bring immense knowledge to us as scholars and certainly as humanists as well. I'd like to now remind us that landscapes of tea are not just plant-based. They are monoculture landscapes, but they're also multi-species landscapes. One of the things about the tea bush is that it provides an ideal hiding spot. It's a great place to play hide and seek, by the way. We have insects in the tea bush, cobras and other snakes, coil under the tea bushes as well. Famously, leopard cubs will show up occasionally. This particular chap was found last year in a tea garden in the Duas, which is the area that Shumona is from, and a very endearing picture. And so the tea laborer is really at the front lines of not just plucking tea. She's responsible for the tea in your teacup, but she's constantly encountering the physicality of the bush, the scratchiness of the branches, the tea leaf itself, and she's encountering the animals that inhabit these landscapes. One of the remarkable things about the Indian plantations, and it's both an assuring story as well as a sobering one, is that we still do have a remarkable range of wildlife in tea plantations in India on a scale that you do not see elsewhere. And this relationship between the plantation and the animal has been a very contested, a very fraught one, because of course wildlife, especially big mammals, are considered unruly agents. They are not welcome in the plantation. So plantations typically have to be kept free of wildlife. And this has been part and parcel, of course, of plantations from the very beginning, from their inception as 19th century landscapes. In fact, if you look at Antoinette Burton and Reni Sabmawani's latest book on animal lives, they talk about imperial sovereignty as being biopolitical, and that very specific and deliberate choices were made about what could be kept out of a plantation and what would remain within it. And these choices, however guided, however controlled, are constantly being resisted by animals, because of course animals do not know borders. They don't recognize border making. They do not recognize imperial sovereignty. They are creatures of their own habits, their own impulses. They will come and go as they please. So I'm showing you the book jacket covers of two memoirs. Planters, tea planters, colonial as well as Indian, were famous for their hunting, shall we say, practices. This was, of course, an era when hunting was not only accepted, but it was necessary to build plantation life. And we have P.H.R. Longley's Tea Planter Sahib on the one side to your left from 1969. And we have A.R. Ramsden's Assam Tea Planter from 1945. Both of these planters spent between 30 to 40 years in India. And the region that they spend most of their lives in is Assam, which Vinita flagged in her talk. The Assam being the area where hunting was considered the most productive because of the extraordinary biodiversity and richness of wildlife to be encountered there. So in Longley's book, you can see in the jacket cover that a tiger comes around the tea bush. And so we have an animal on the prowl. The planter is startled, but is ready with his gun, in part because the planter is accustomed to wildlife showing up on the plantation, so they will be equipped in advance with these weapons of destruction. And what's quite fascinating in this particular instance, in this illustration, is how the tea bush itself is guiding animal behavior now. So the animal comes around, looks at the planter, and is literally navigating those aisles that you see being made by the workers in the 19th century photograph. Now, what's fascinating is when you read Planter's memoirs, you will see that the tea bush becomes almost a spectacular sight of death. There are tales of tigers that spring upon laborers and accidentally get impaled on the tea bush and are roaring their heads off. Now, keep in mind that, a full-grown tiger from nose to sort of tip of the tail can be about 13 feet long. They're very powerful mammals. So for them to land on a tea bush means that the weight of the bush will, of course, collapse under the tiger, but will also penetrate the tiger itself. So these are very sort of bloodied landscapes. It's something that we've forgotten about because, of course, the tiger population has shrunk dramatically in India, thanks to, again, human interventions. But if you read through the 1960s, you will see again and again and again these spectacular encounters with tigers, bushes spattered with blood. So this sort of idyllic vision of green plantations, this verdant expanse, becomes a very, very different sight when you start thinking through these landscapes with the people who inhabited them and the animals who inhabited these landscapes as well. One of the things, of course, that we have to keep in mind is that tiger hunting also emerges as a sport among planters. It's part sport, it's also part necessity. And it occupies a very interesting space vis-a-vis, let's say, the royal hunt, which is the tradition of Indian tiger hunting, extremely expensive. I'm showing you a famous picture of Lord Curzon and the Maharaj of Scindia posing with their tiger skins in 1911. Of course, when it was a royal hunt, it was a very elaborate affair. When it came to planters, it was not so elaborate, and they were living with the tiger. Unlike the royals, they are actually inhabiting these landscapes in which tigers and other forms of wildlife come in and out at any given moment. And I want to draw your attention to the gun, because the rifle that you're seeing here is very, very important. And if you remember the slide I showed you earlier of the Assam planter, you have the rifle stacked up right outside, or rather inside the room, which will lead into the veranda space. So it's in a very critical zone of the planter's bungalow. And of course, above the rifles hangs a tiger trophy itself. And going back to Michel Foucault, whose name has been mentioned before, I think Vinita quoted from him as well, we think about the idea of discipline on a plantation. That discipline, according to Foucault, and I quote here, defines each of the relations that the body must have with the object that it manipulates. And in this case, the discipline is mediated through, of course, that gun itself, the object that is held by the planter and that gives him this triumphant pose, very much like an Indian royal in this instance. But this image is also quite powerful, I think, for laborers, because it would have evoked images like this. Again, a great company painting. Many of these are also in Indian collections, by the way, of Durga and Mahishasur. Durga astride a lion. Durga is also, by the way, shown on a tiger. And here again, I've shown you slides of tea plucking and the idea of how plant humanities can also make us urge us to think about the tactile experience of plucking a tea leaf. Here, I'd like us to think about what it must have been like to stand so triumphantly on a tiger, this powerful animal. It's almost as if the planter is absorbing the energy of the tiger that has been roaming among the tea bushes in the forest as a quote unquote intruder. And this gives the planter this enormous surge, or shall we say, of triumphant energy that is then conveyed in the photograph that we see here, making him almost godlike in the eyes, of course, of the laborers around him. There was an entire industry of taxidermy that grows, that evolves with the tea industry. And I'm showing you a leopard head, which I managed to trace, leopards being the other big cats that show up on plantations, which went on auction a few years ago. And of course, for someone like me who works on material culture and art history, it was thrilling to see that the label was still attached to the shield, the back of the shield, to which the leopard's head is now tethered. And we know that it was commissioned by a man named William Leach from Lamabari Tea Estate, which is in Assam, and it dates to 1930. The taxidermists in question were Cuthbertson and Harper, who had their own shop in Government Place in Calcutta. They were also leather manufacturers. You can see saddle and boot makers. And I'm taking you to the city of Calcutta, which, as I mentioned, is the hub of the tea trade till today. And there is Cuthbertson and Harper's shop, from an old photograph by Samuel Bourne, taken by Samuel Bourne in the late 19th century. And Cuthbertson and Harper's shop, very interestingly, sits right next to the Great Eastern Hotel, one of the iconic hotels, heritage hotels of Kolkata, which has been revived today. And the Great Eastern Hotel is exactly where the tea planters would stay en route to their plantations from Britain, and also on their way back to Britain as well. So it is very much an urban hub for the planter. I also bring this image up to remind us that as much as we're looking at plants in herbaria or in plantations, as I've shown you today, that we also have to remember that these histories are enmeshed, they're entangled with the histories of urban spaces like Calcutta. So here we have Cuthbertson and Harper, who are creating products like the taxidermied heads for clients in the plantations. In other words, the taxidermied head becomes an urban commodity that is being then reinserted into the tea plantation and developing new stories, shall we say, of virility, of masculinity and triumph while they're out there. One of the most remarkably intact collection of taxidermy heads is in the south of India at the High Range Club in Munnar, a tea planters club built in 1905. And here we have a spread of heads made by Van Ingen and Van Ingen of Mysore, who actually supplied taxidermied heads for Indian royals. And so we have this wonderful intersection, very macabre intersection of the afterlives of these animals, which are celebrated again as trophies that tea planters are bringing into their own domestic spaces. So as a reminder, I end now with another beloved animal of India, the elephant. And it makes us question, as do other animals, as we continue to contend with the slow yet steady march of climate change and deforestation, how do we reimagine plantations as animal corridors? Plantations have traditionally been animal corridors. We have removed those animal corridors, and now we see a greater attempt to, in fact, acknowledge them. How do animals remain integral to our encounters with plants like tea? How do we remake our expectations of landscapes so that the human and non-human can remain entangled? If, as a Nakshalbari tea estate advertisement tantalizes us, as you see here, with the possibility of finding joy in every cup of tea, we might in fact remember that the tea we drink is not just made by human hands, but in partnership with the wildlife that inhabits plantations, enriching the soil and water, the very elements threatened by climate change and environmental degradation. Their very existence assures us that tea is here to stay for now. Thank you.